I gave my best friend the keys to my house and told her one simple thing: just take care of it until I come back. 4 years later, when I finally returned, my own key didn't fit into my own front door anymore. A stranger opened that door instead and told me my best friend and her husband were the real owners now. My furniture was gone, my parents' documents had disappeared, and the neighbors who had known me my whole life looked at me like I was the outsider standing on someone else's property. What happened inside those 4 years while I was working myself to exhaustion on the other side of the world wasn't an accident. It was a plan. And by the time I discovered the truth, I realized the people I trusted the most had spent years quietly convincing an entire neighborhood, and even a court of law, that everything I once called mine now belonged to them. My name is Vaidehi Narang, and I need to tell you something that took me 4 years to fully understand. Sometimes the people who smile at you the widest are the ones quietly waiting for you to leave. I was 33 years old when I finally held that visa in my hands. Not 23, not fresh out of college with nothing to lose. 33, with a life already built around me. A small government job in Delhi that paid just enough to survive. A mother who had passed 2 years earlier. And a house. My house. The only thing my parents had left me that actually mattered. That house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was where my father used to sit on the veranda every evening with his newspaper, where my mother's kitchen still smelled faintly of cardamom no matter how many years passed, where I had grown from a girl who was afraid of the dark into a woman who had learned, slowly and painfully, to be alone. When both my parents were gone, that house became the only proof I had that I once belonged to a family. So when the acceptance letter came from a university in the United States, a master's program I had applied to almost as a joke, never believing I would actually get in, I sat on the floor of that same house and cried for almost an hour, not just from joy, from fear too, because saying yes to that opportunity meant leaving behind everything I had left. I want to be honest with you. I almost didn't go. I had nobody in India to hold on to anymore. But the house itself felt like a person to me. Leaving it empty for years felt like abandoning a family member in a hospital bed. That's when Ishani came into the picture. Ishani Dev had been my best friend since we were 14 years old. We went to the same school, sat behind each other in almost every class, and later, when both our lives fell apart in different ways, her parents' painful divorce, my mother's long illness, we became each other's family in the truest sense of the word. I trusted her the way you trust your own reflection. It never once crossed my mind that trust could be a mistake. When I told her about the visa, she screamed with excitement before I even finished the sentence. She hugged me so tightly, I nearly lost my balance. "You're finally going to see the world," she said, tears in her eyes. And in that moment, watching her be genuinely happy for me, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. "Ishani," I said, "would you stay in my house while I'm gone? I don't want it sitting empty. I don't want thieves getting in, or the pipes bursting, or termites eating through everything my parents built. I need someone I trust to be there." She looked at me like I had offered her the moon. "Are you serious?" she asked. "You'd really let me live there? Free of rent," I told her. "You don't owe me anything except one thing. Take care of it like it's your own. Because when I come back, I want to walk into a home, not into a graveyard of memories." She cried. She actually cried, right there in my mother's old kitchen, and told me she would guard that house like it was a temple. She promised me, with her hand on her heart, that she would treat it with more care than I could ever imagine. I believed every word. At the time, Ishani was engaged to a man named Ronav Khattar, a businessman from a modest trading family who worked long hours and rarely smiled, at least not around me. I didn't know him well, but Ishani spoke about him with a kind of practical affection, not passionate love, but comfort, stability. I remember thinking, at least she'll have someone with her in that house. At least she won't be lonely. I helped her move some of her things in before I left. I remember standing in the doorway of my parents' old bedroom, watching her arrange her suitcase on the same bed where my mother used to fold laundry, and feeling this strange, quiet ache in my chest. Not because I doubted her, because change, even good change, always leaves a small wound behind. The week before I flew out, I did something I now think about constantly. I sat down with Ishani and we made a simple agreement, not a legal contract, just a spoken promise between two women who had known each other for almost 20 years. She would live in the house rent-free. She would maintain it, pay the basic utility bills from a small allowance I left behind, and keep my documents, my parents' property papers, my old letters, my mother's jewelry box that held nothing valuable except memory, safe in the back room, untouched. When I come back, I told her, only half joking, I expect this house to look exactly the same, maybe even better. She laughed. You'll come back and find I've turned it into a palace, she said. I left India on a cold morning in early autumn, my 2 suitcases containing almost everything I owned that could fit into fabric and zippers. I remember looking back at the house from the taxi window, watching Ishani wave from the gate, her hand raised high, her smile wide and warm. I told myself, I am the luckiest woman alive. My best friend is protecting my home while I chase my future. The first year in the United States nearly broke me. I want you to understand, this wasn't a glamorous adventure. I lived in a shared apartment with 3 other students, all strangers, all exhausted in our own ways. I worked in a small grocery store on weekends, stacking shelves at 5 in the morning before rushing to class, and then working again in the university library at night just to afford rent and food. I studied until my eyes burned. I called Ishani whenever I could, usually late at night, my voice barely above a whisper so I wouldn't wake my roommates. In the beginning, she answered almost every time. She would tell me about the house, how she had planted new flowers near the gate, how she had fixed a leaking tap in the bathroom, how she had kept my mother's old photographs dusted and displayed exactly where they always were. I remember feeling this deep, warm relief every single time we spoke. Someone out there was keeping my roots alive while I built new ones somewhere else. But somewhere around the 2nd year, the calls started getting shorter. She would answer, but distracted. Background noise, a television playing. Sometimes a man's voice I assumed was Ronav's. She married him quietly during my 2nd year abroad, a small ceremony I couldn't attend because of my visa restrictions and my nearly empty bank account. I sent her money for a gift anyway, along with a long letter congratulating her, telling her how much I wished I could be there. She thanked me, but something in her tone had changed. It was subtle, the kind of shift you only notice looking back, never in the moment itself. I told myself it was just marriage, just new responsibilities, just life pulling her attention elsewhere the way life does to everyone eventually. By the 3rd year, our calls became monthly instead of weekly. Then, eventually, they became rare enough that I started reaching out first almost every single time. When I asked about the house, her answers grew vague. Everything's fine, she would say. Don't worry about it. Focus on your studies. I wanted to trust her. I needed to trust her because if I let even a sliver of doubt into my mind, I would have to face the terrifying possibility that the only home I had left in this world might not be waiting for me the way I imagined. I finished my degree in my 4th year abroad, exhausted but proud, holding a piece of paper that represented 4 years of sacrifice, loneliness, and quiet resilience. I had saved almost every rupee and dollar I could, dreaming of finally walking through that gate again, seeing my mother's kitchen, sitting on that same veranda where my father once read his newspapers. I booked my flight home with trembling hands, unaware that the woman I called my sister had spent those same 4 years slowly, carefully, turning my house into something she believed belonged to her. I had no idea that when I finally arrived, the locks on my own front door would no longer open with my key. The flight back to India felt longer than the flight that had taken me away 4 years earlier. I remember sitting by the window, watching the clouds beneath me, replaying every phone call with Ishani in my mind, searching for some clue I might have missed. Looking back now, I think some part of me already sensed something was wrong. I just didn't want to believe it. I landed at Indira Gandhi International Airport just after sunrise. My body was heavy with jet lag, my heart pounding with something between excitement and unease. I hadn't told Ishani the exact date I was arriving. I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to walk through that gate and see her face light up the way it used to when we were young. I wanted my homecoming to feel like the ending of a story I had been writing in my head for 4 long years. I took a taxi straight from the airport, my 2 suitcases in the trunk, my hands trembling with anticipation the closer we got to my neighborhood. The streets looked both familiar and strange, the way home always does after a long absence. The same shops, but repainted. The same trees, but taller. The same air, but somehow different. When the taxi finally turned onto my street, my chest tightened. There it was, my house, still standing, still the same pale yellow color my father had chosen decades ago. For a moment, just looking at it from the car window, I felt like nothing had ever changed. I felt like I could walk through that door and find my mother's kitchen exactly as I left it. I paid the driver, pulled my suitcases to the gate, and reached for my key. It didn't fit. I remember standing there for almost a full minute, trying again and again, assuming I was simply tired, disoriented, using the wrong key from my crowded keyring. But no matter how many times I tried, the lock refused to turn. My key, the same key I had carried across an ocean and back, no longer belonged to my own front door. I knocked. A young woman I didn't recognize opened the door, a small child balanced on her hip. She looked at me with confusion, the same confusion I imagine was written across my own face. "Can I help you?" she asked. "This is my house," I said, my voice shakier than I intended. "I'm looking for Ishani Dev." The woman's expression shifted, uncomfortable. "Ishani and Ronav live here," she said slowly. "But I think you might be confused. This house belongs to them. We're renting the small room in the back from them." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Renting. Someone was renting a room in my own house from Ishani, as though she were the landlord and I was a stranger standing at the gate. I asked her to call Ishani, my hands trembling around the handle of my suitcase. Within minutes, I saw her walking toward the gate from inside the house. My best friend, 4 years older, her hair styled differently, her expression unreadable in a way I had never seen before. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said my name, softly, almost gently. Vaidehi. I don't know what I expected in that moment. Maybe tears, maybe an embrace, maybe an apology for something I didn't yet understand. Instead, what I got was silence, followed by a careful, rehearsed calm that frightened me more than anger would have. "Why can't I get into my own house?" I asked her directly, my voice cracking despite my effort to stay composed. She glanced behind her, then back at me, lowering her voice. "Vaidehi, we need to talk. Not here, not like this." She led me to a small tea stall down the street, away from the neighbors, away from the child balanced on the young woman's hip, away from whatever life had been built inside my parents' home while I was gone. We sat across from each other at a plastic table, and for the first time in 4 years, I looked closely at the face of the woman I had once trusted more than anyone else alive. "I know this looks strange," she began. "Strange?" I repeated. "Ishani, my key doesn't work. A stranger just told me you and Ronav own this house. What is going on?" She took a long breath, and then she told me a story that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. She explained that over the past 4 years, she and Ronav had invested significant money into the house: new plumbing, a renovated kitchen, repaired flooring, a repainted exterior. She listed numbers, expenses, receipts I had never seen or approved. She spoke about property taxes she claimed to have paid on my behalf, about small loans she said she took to keep the house standing, about years of labor and sacrifice she insisted I owed her for. "You were gone for 4 years, Vaidehi," she said, her tone shifting from soft to something almost defensive. "You have no idea what it took to keep this house from falling apart. I gave up so much for this place. I gave you the house to protect it," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Not to take it." Her eyes hardened slightly. "Nobody signed anything giving you sole ownership after everything we invested," she said. "Ronav believes, and honestly, so do I, that after 4 years of living here, maintaining it, improving it, this house is as much ours now as it was ever yours." I felt something inside me break in that moment, quiet and complete. Not just the shock of losing access to my own home, but the deeper, more devastating realization that the woman across from me had spent 4 years quietly building a case against me while pretending every single phone call that she was simply protecting what belonged to her best friend. "Where are my things?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "My mother's jewelry, my father's papers, The property documents? Ishani looked away. Some things got damaged during the renovation, she said. Old papers, some boxes. We didn't know what was important and what wasn't. We had to make space. I stood up so quickly the plastic chair nearly toppled behind me. You threw away my parents' belongings? I said, loud enough that a few people at nearby tables turned to look. You threw away my property documents? Vaidehi, please, sit down, she said, glancing around nervously. This doesn't have to become ugly. We can figure something out. Maybe we could offer you some compensation for your share, and you could move on with your life in America. You clearly built something wonderful there. I stared at her. This woman I had known since we were 14 years old, and realized I no longer recognized the person sitting across from me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion born from 4 years of distance and different lives. This was a plan, slow, patient, and deliberate, built brick by brick, while I worked myself into exhaustion on the other side of the world, believing every phone call was proof of loyalty rather than evidence of a carefully maintained lie. That night, I stood outside my parents' house with nowhere to sleep, my suitcases beside me on the pavement, staring up at windows that used to be mine. I thought about calling someone, anyone, for help, but realized with a cold, sinking feeling that I had no one left in India except the very people who had just betrayed me. I checked into a cheap guest house a few streets away, lying awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every warm word Ishani had ever said to me over the phone, wondering how many of them had been lies even then. The next morning, I made a decision that would consume the following months of my life. I was going to fight for that house, not just because of its walls or its market value, but because it was the last physical piece of my parents left in this world. And I was going to find out exactly how much of my trust had been quietly, methodically turned into a weapon against me. I had no idea, sitting in that guest house with a cup of lukewarm tea, just how far Ishani and Ronav had already gone to make sure the law itself would side with them. The morning after that conversation at the tea stall, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Grief has strange effects on people. Some freeze, some collapse. I found myself becoming unusually calm, almost cold, the way I imagine soldiers must feel walking into a battle they didn't choose but no longer intend to lose. My first stop was the local municipal office, where property records were kept. I remembered my father registering the house decades earlier, remembered accompanying him as a child while he filed paperwork, watching him proudly fold the documents into a worn leather folder he kept in his cupboard for years. That folder, along with everything else, was apparently gone now, thrown away during Ishani's so-called renovation. The clerk at the municipal office, an older man with tired eyes, pulled up records on an ancient computer while I stood there holding my breath. What he told me sent a chill through my entire body. According to our records, he said slowly, adjusting his glasses, the property was transferred through a registered agreement 4 years ago. I felt the floor tilt beneath me for the second time in 2 days. Transferred? To whom? He turned the screen toward me. There it was, in official government print, a property transfer document, dated almost exactly 1 year after I had left for the United States, listing Ishani Dev and Ronav Qatar as the new registered occupants with rights of maintenance and habitation, based on what the document called a verbal gift arrangement supported by 2 witnesses. 2 witnesses. I recognized both names instantly. One was Ishani's older cousin, a man I had met perhaps twice at family gatherings. The other was a neighbor who had lived 3 houses down from mine for as long as I could remember, a quiet woman named Priya, who used to wave at me every morning on my way to school as a teenager. I felt sick, not just betrayed, but hunted. This wasn't a moment of desperation or a spontaneous decision made after months of confusion. Someone had planned this, filed paperwork, arranged witnesses, and built an entire legal narrative while I was thousands of miles away, believing every reassuring phone call was proof of loyalty. I spent that afternoon trying to find a lawyer, walking from office to office with nothing but a passport, a university degree, and desperation. Most lawyers I approached either quoted fees I couldn't afford after 4 years of careful saving, or looked at my case with visible discomfort. explaining that property disputes involving long-term occupation and local witnesses were notoriously difficult and slow, sometimes dragging through courts for many years. Finally, exhausted and nearly out of hope, I found a woman named Meenal Oberoi, a young lawyer who had recently opened her own small practice. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes, her expression growing more serious as I spoke. "This is not going to be simple," she told me honestly once I finished. "But it's also not hopeless. If you never signed a formal gift deed, and if you can prove ownership existed before you left the country, we have a foundation to challenge this transfer." For the first time since I had knocked on my own front door, I felt something other than despair, a small, fragile thread of hope. Over the following weeks, Meenal and I built our case piece by piece. We tracked down the original bank documents showing my parents' mortgage payments decades earlier. We found an old insurance policy still listing me as the sole owner, something Ishani apparently hadn't thought to alter. We located a distant relative of my father's who still had a copy of the original property deed, preserved among old family papers, proving legitimate inheritance directly to me after my parents passed away. But the most painful part of building that case wasn't collecting documents. It was collecting testimonies. I reached out to old neighbors, people who had known my family for decades, hoping they would remember the truth clearly enough to speak on my behalf. What I discovered broke something inside me all over again. Some neighbors, out of fear of confrontation or simple unwillingness to get involved, refused to say anything at all, claiming they didn't remember clearly or didn't want trouble. Others, more disturbingly, seemed to genuinely believe Ishani and Ronav were the rightful owners, having lived beside them for 4 years, watching them renovate, pay bills, and present themselves publicly as the homeowners in every possible way. Perception, I learned, can become its own kind of truth when repeated long enough. Then there was Priya, the neighbor listed as a witness on that transfer document. When I visited her home, hoping she might explain herself, she refused to meet my eyes. "Ishani told me it was already arranged with you," she said quietly, standing in her doorway, unwilling to invite me inside. "She said you agreed to it before you left, that you two had discussed it, and she just needed it formalized for practical reasons, taxes and things like that. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong." "And you never thought to call me?" I asked. "You've had my number for years." She looked down at her feet. I didn't want to get involved in a friendship. I trusted her. I walked away from that conversation feeling something shift permanently inside me. It wasn't just Ishani who had betrayed me. It was an entire quiet ecosystem of convenient belief built slowly around a lie repeated often enough, confidently enough, that people simply stopped questioning it. The court proceedings began roughly 2 months after my return. I sat in a modest courtroom, watching Ishani and Ronav sit across the aisle from me, dressed formally, composed, presenting themselves as a reasonable couple who had simply maintained a property abandoned by an absent friend. Their lawyer spoke about renovation costs, about years of tax payments, about emotional and financial investment. He spoke about hardship, about how unfair it would be to displace a family that had built a life within those walls for 4 years. I sat there listening, feeling my own story twisted into something unrecognizable, transformed into a narrative where I was the reckless one, the one who abandoned responsibility, while Ishani became the loyal caretaker who simply asked for fair recognition after years of sacrifice. When it was my turn to speak, my hands were shaking, but my voice remained steady. I spoke about my parents, about the house they built with decades of careful saving, about the promise Ishani made, with tears in her eyes, the day I left for America. I spoke about phone calls filled with warmth and reassurance that I now understood had been carefully performed, month after month, to keep me trusting and unaware, while paperwork quietly stripped away my ownership. The judge, an older man with a stern but fair expression, asked pointed questions to both sides. He asked Ishani directly whether any formal written agreement existed transferring ownership. She hesitated before answering, glancing briefly at Ronav before responding that the agreement had been verbal, based on years of trust between lifelong friends. I watched the judge's expression shift slightly at that answer, a small flicker of skepticism that gave me the first real sense that perhaps, despite everything stacked against me, the truth still carried weight in that room. But as the first hearing concluded, and we were told to return in several weeks for further evidence review, Meenal pulled me aside outside the courthouse, her expression cautious. Vaidehi, she said, I need to tell you something important. Ranav's lawyer mentioned they intend to bring forward additional witnesses next time. People willing to testify that you verbally agreed to gift the house before you left the country. My stomach turned. That's not true, I said. None of that ever happened. I believe you, Meenal said gently. But in cases like this, sometimes the truth isn't enough on its own. We need to prepare for exactly how far they're willing to go to make their version of events sound convincing. That night, back in the small rented room I had been staying in since my return, I stared at the ceiling once again, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I thought about the 4 years I had spent scrubbing floors in a grocery store at dawn, studying until my eyes burned, sending money home not for myself, but to help maintain a house I believed was being lovingly protected. I had crossed an ocean to build a future. I never imagined I would have to return home and fight, with everything I had left, simply to prove that the past, my own family, my own inheritance, actually belonged to me at all. The weeks between hearings felt longer than the 4 years I had spent abroad. I lived in a small rented room with peeling paint on the walls, working part-time at a call center just to survive while my case slowly crawled through the court system. Every evening, I sat with Meenal reviewing documents, rehearsing testimony, trying to anticipate whatever new tactic Ishani and Ranav might bring to the next hearing. True to Meenal's warning, they arrived at the second hearing with 3 additional witnesses, all claiming, with unsettling confidence, that they had personally heard me agree to gift the house to Ishani before I left for the United States. One was a distant acquaintance of Ranav's family. Another was a shopkeeper who claimed I had mentioned it casually while buying groceries years earlier, a memory I knew was fabricated because I had barely spoken to that man beyond simple transactions. Listening to strangers describe conversations that never happened, delivered with calm, rehearsed certainty, was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. It made me question, for brief, terrifying moments, whether I was somehow misremembering my own history. That, I realized later, was exactly the intended effect. But Meenal had prepared for this possibility. She had spent weeks quietly gathering something Ishani never expected: digital evidence. Years of text messages between us, still preserved on an old phone backup I had stored in cloud storage without even remembering I had it. Messages where Ishani thanked me repeatedly for trusting her with your home. Messages where she referred to needing your permission for larger repairs. Messages spanning years that consistently, unmistakably referred to the house as belonging to me, not her. When Meenal presented these messages in court, reading them aloud one by one, I watched something shift in the judge's expression, and more importantly, something crack in Ishani's composed exterior. For the first time since I had returned to India, I saw her hands tremble slightly as she sat beside her lawyer. Ranav's lawyer tried to argue that private messages between friends didn't reflect legal reality, that emotional language wasn't the same as legal ownership. But the judge, reviewing the timeline carefully, pointed out something that would ultimately unravel their entire case. Several of the most affectionate, gratitude-filled messages from Ishani were sent months after the supposed property transfer document had allegedly been signed. If Ishani genuinely believed, at the time of those messages, that the house had already legally become hers, why would she continue thanking me for lending it to her? Why would she keep referring to needing my permission for repairs on a house she claimed to already own? The contradiction was small, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely, but it was enough to plant serious doubt. Over the following 2 hearings, that doubt grew steadily into something undeniable. Meenal presented the original insurance documents still listing me as sole owner, the family inheritance papers proving legitimate transfer from my parents, and testimony from my father's distant relative confirming the property's history in detail. Slowly, methodically, we rebuilt a truth that had been buried under years of quiet manipulation. The turning point came during the 4th hearing, when the judge directly questioned the two original witnesses listed on the property transfer document, Ishani's cousin and our former neighbor, Priya. Under formal questioning, away from Ishani's influence, Priya's composure finally broke. She admitted, voice shaking, that she had never actually witnessed any conversation between Ishani and myself regarding the house. She confessed that Ishani had approached her nearly a year after I left, explaining that she needed a witness for paperwork formalities and assuring her that I already knew and approved. Priya admitted she signed the document out of trust in Ishani, without ever verifying anything directly with me. Ishani's cousin, when questioned separately, gave a similarly hesitant answer, unable to provide specific details about any conversation he supposedly witnessed, eventually admitting he had simply been asked to sign as a formality without fully understanding the document's legal weight. Watching that unfold in the courtroom, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only exhaustion and a strange, hollow sadness, because in that moment, it became undeniably clear that the woman I had once considered my sister had spent years constructing a slow, patient deception, using people's trust in her, including my own, as building blocks for a lie. The judge's final ruling came nearly 5 months after I had first stood outside my own locked front door. He ruled that the property transfer document was invalid, built on witness testimony that failed to meet basic legal standards of direct knowledge and unsupported by any legitimate written agreement between myself and Ishani. He ordered the property returned to my full legal ownership, along with a formal directive requiring Ishani and Ranav to vacate within 60 days. I remember sitting in that courtroom as the ruling was read aloud, feeling numb rather than victorious. Somewhere behind me, I heard Ishani crying quietly, though I never turned around to look at her face. Outside the courthouse, she approached me one final time, her eyes red, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers. "Vaidehi, please," she said. "We have nowhere else to go. Ranav's business isn't doing well. We invested everything into that house." I looked at her for a long moment, searching for the girl who used to share her lunch with me in school, who cried with me at my mother's funeral, who once promised to guard my home like a temple. I couldn't find her anymore. "You had 4 years," I told her quietly. 4 years to tell me the truth, to ask me honestly for help if you needed it. Instead, you chose to erase me from my own life and hope I would simply disappear into a new one abroad. I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked away, carrying with me not victory, but a quiet, aching clarity about how easily love can be weaponized by people who understand exactly how deeply you trust them. It took another 2 months of legal procedures before I finally, truly reclaimed my house. When I walked through that gate for the first time as its rightful, undisputed owner, the rooms were unfamiliar. Repainted walls, rearranged furniture, no trace of my mother's kitchen smell, no sign of my father's veranda chair. Everything that once made it feel like home had been slowly erased during those 4 years, piece by piece, the same way my trust had been. I stood in the empty living room that first night, sitting on the floor because there was no furniture left that belonged to me, and I cried for a long time, not just for the house, but for the friendship I had lost, for the version of myself who had once believed loyalty was permanent, for 4 years of my life spent building a future on the other side of the world while my past was quietly being stolen behind my back. But I also felt something else that night, something unexpected, relief. Not because I had won, but because I finally understood the truth completely, without doubt, without wondering, without the exhausting weight of not knowing who to trust. I spent the following months slowly rebuilding that house from the ground up, room by room, choosing new furniture with my own hands, repainting the walls in colors my mother once loved, planting new flowers by the gate exactly where Ishani once told me she had planted her own. I wanted the house to feel like mine again, not as a monument to what was taken from me, but as proof that I could rebuild whatever was broken, both around me and inside me. Today, I still live in that house, alone but no longer lonely, surrounded by memories that finally belong entirely to me again. I never spoke to Ishani again after that day outside the courthouse. I heard, through distant acquaintances, that she and Ronav eventually moved to a smaller rented apartment across the city. their finances strained after months of legal fees and lost investments. I don't feel joy in her hardship. I only feel a quiet, permanent understanding that some people, when given years of unsupervised access to something precious, will slowly convince themselves they deserve to keep it forever. If you ever lend someone your trust the way you lend them your keys, remember this: distance doesn't just test love, it tests character. And sometimes, the people who promise to guard your home most fiercely are the ones quietly measuring how long it will take before they can call it their own.